My name is Marcus. I'm 29 years old, and I need to tell you something before I start, because I've been trying to work out how to say it for almost a year now. Two of my friends went to Jiuhua Shan with me. Two of them didn't come back the way they went. I don't mean they died. That would be in some ways easier to explain. One of them, Tom, hasn't been found. The other, Dan, is alive. He's in a facility in Wiltshire. He doesn't speak. He doesn't move unless someone moves him first. He sits in the same position every day, hands rested on his knees, eyes open, breathing slowly. He's been doing that for 11 months. The doctors have a diagnosis. Several of them. They've used words like catatonia, dissociative episode, trauma-induced withdrawal. I've read every report they've written about him. None of them explain what I watched happen to him on that mountain. None of them have been to Jiuhua Shan. None of them have stood in that room. I'm telling this story because I think I owe it to Tom and Dan to say out loud what actually happened. I've spent months keeping it clean when I talk to people, editing it down to something manageable. We went. Things went wrong. One person went missing. One person had a breakdown. That's what I tell people. That's not what happened. There were four of us. Myself, Tom, Dan, and Chloe. We'd been friends since university. Tom was the one who suggested the trip. He always was. He had a gift for finding places that looked unremarkable on a map and turned out to be extraordinary in person. He'd taken us to a coastal town in Croatia that didn't appear in any guidebook, a disused factory in Leipzig that had been converted into something halfway between an art installation and a dream. He had good instincts. He'd never had bad instincts before that trip. He found Jiuhua Shan in a photography forum. Someone had posted a set of images: mountain mist, stone staircases, monks in saffron robes moving between temples, and one photograph that stopped Tom mid-scroll. He sent it to our group chat with no comment, just the image. It was a monk sitting in full lotus position inside a glass case. He was covered in gold leaf. His face was serene. His eyes were almost closed. He looked like he was sleeping. He was not sleeping. He had been dead for several hundred years. Let me tell you about the mountain. Jiuhua Shan is one of the four sacred Buddhist mountains of China. It sits in Anhui province, in the east of the country. It has been a place of pilgrimage for over 1,300 years. There are 99 temples on it. Monks have been living and dying there for longer than most Western countries have existed. It is also extraordinarily beautiful. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. When we arrived, early September, 2 years ago, the place didn't feel threatening. It felt like something out of a painting you'd only ever seen reproductions of. The mist comes in off the valleys in the morning and wraps around the lower temples so that they appear to float. The higher you climb, the quieter it gets. Not the quiet of absence. The quiet of something very old that has been listening for a long time. We'd spent a week in Shanghai before the mountain. Tom had done the research, as he always did. He'd printed a set of notes, the history of the mountain, the pilgrimage routes, the temples, and in among those notes, there was a section he'd highlighted. The monks of Jiuhua Shan practice something called rushain. It translates roughly as flesh body. It refers to the preservation of a monk's physical form after death. The belief is that certain monks, through decades of intense meditation and spiritual practice, achieve a state in which their body does not decay after death. They are exhumed. Their form is examined. If they have been preserved, if the body is whole, they are considered a living Buddha. They are covered in gold, leaf, and lacquer. They are placed in a glass case or a shrine, and they remain there. Several of them are still there today, sitting, waiting, in a sense that I only began to understand later. There is one detail from Tom's notes that I've thought about almost every day since. The older form of the practice was different. In the older form, the monk did not simply meditate until death came. He chose it deliberately. He stopped eating solid food. He consumed only nuts, seeds, bark, water, enough to continue living, not enough to sustain the body's fat or tissue. Then, when the process had continued for years, he would enter a small stone chamber. He would ring a bell. As long as the bell rang, the monks outside knew he was still alive. When the bell stopped ringing, they sealed the chamber. He remained inside, alone, in the dark, for years. Some of them were preserved when they were exhumed. Some of them were not. The ones who were preserved were given the gold. The ones who were not were buried in the mountain. Tom read this to us over dinner in Shanghai. He said, "Can you imagine what it was like? The last thing you heard was the sound of them sealing the door." None of us answered. Chloe looked at her food. Dan, who had been quiet all evening, said nothing. I remember looking at him. He was staring at the table as if he'd gone somewhere else. We arrived at the mountain on a Tuesday. The lower temples were open to visitors. We spent the first day moving between them, burning incense at the request of a kind elderly monk who gestured us through the ritual with patient hands, walking the stone paths that wound upward between old pines, watching pilgrims move in slow and purposeful silence, with the kind of focus that makes you feel slightly ashamed of your own restlessness. The mummified monks were in the upper section of the mountain, accessible to visitors but displayed with care and formality. Each one had a temple dedicated to them. You filed in through a set of doors, made a circuit of the room, and they sat in their glass cases at the far end, bathed in soft light, entirely gold, entirely still. I will tell you honestly, they were not frightening in the way you might expect. They were something else. They had the quality of something suspended, not dead and not alive, but held in a state between the two that human beings don't have a clean word for. Their faces, beneath the gold, were arranged in expressions of absolute peace. Whatever they had been moving toward when they rang that bell for the last time, they looked as though they had reached it. We spent a long time in the third temple. Dan stood in front of the case for nearly 20 minutes. I noticed, because Tom made a comment about it, something light, intended to cut the atmosphere, and Dan didn't respond. He was standing very still. His hands were at his sides. He wasn't doing anything dramatic. He was simply looking at the monk in a way that I found difficult to read. When I touched his arm to move on, he startled. He looked at me, like he'd forgotten I was there. "Sorry," he said. "I was thinking." "About what?" He looked back at the case once more before we left. "About how quiet it must have been," he said, "in the chamber. Once the bell stopped. The old monk who managed the third temple was watching us from near the door. He was a small man, maybe 70, with the sort of stillness about him that the mountain itself seemed to encourage. As we moved to leave, he stepped forward and said something in Mandarin. Tom looked at me. Neither of us spoke the language well enough. We had a translation app. Tom held up his phone. The monk repeated what he'd said. The app produced the following: "Do not go to the mountain at night. Some of the monks are still listening." We looked at each other. Tom almost laughed. Dan did not. We should have gone back to the guest house. I want to be clear about that. There was no good reason not to. The mountain wasn't asking anything of us. We had seen what we'd come to see. The sensible version of that evening was a meal, a long sleep, a morning walk down. Tom wanted to go back up after dark. He'd found in a photography forum post a reference to a sealed section in the upper part of the mountain, a cluster of old chambers that had been closed off to visitors at some point in the last decade. The thread was vague about the reason. One person wrote that a group of tourists had reported hearing sounds from within one of the chambers when they pressed their ear to the door. The thread had been deleted. Tom had found it in an archive. I said it was a bad idea. Chloe said it was a very bad idea. Dan said nothing, which, at the time, I read as neutral. Tom went anyway. We followed, because that is what you do with people you've known for 8 years and followed into Croatian towns and Leipzig factories and dozens of other places that turned out fine. The mountain at night is different. I don't have a precise way to say this. The temples were unlit, and the darkness between them was the kind of darkness that doesn't come from the absence of light so much as from the presence of something else, something patient and settled and very, very old. The path sounds different at night. The stone under your feet sounds hollow in places. The pines don't move the way they did in daylight. We had torches. We had good ones. The darkness was still bigger than them. We reached the sealed section after 40 minutes of climbing. It was set back from the main path, behind a low stone wall, and a gate that was not locked so much as roped shut with a cord that had once been red and had faded to something closer to brown. Tom undid the cord. He looked back at us once. I remember this specifically, the expression on his face. And then he pushed the gate open and went through. We followed. The chambers were low, stone-walled, set into the rock of the mountain. Most of them were open, empty rooms with nothing inside but the smell of old incense and something underneath it that I have never successfully identified. Stone floors, bare walls, a stone shelf at waist height along the far side that I understood, after a moment, was where someone would have sat. Dan went very still in the first chamber, not the way he had in front of the monk's case earlier. This was different. That had been contemplative. This was something else. He walked to the center of the room and stopped. He stood with his back to us. He was facing the stone shelf. Dan. Nothing. Dan. Mate. He turned around slowly. His face was... I don't have a good word for what his face was. Not frightened. Not blank. It was the expression of someone who has just understood something, and the understanding was not good. We need to go, he said. Right now. We just got here, Tom said. Tom. He said it in a way that should have been enough. We need to go. Tom had moved further along the passage, toward the next chamber. He was shining his torch at the walls, already absorbed in whatever he was seeing. Chloe looked at me. I looked at Dan. Tom, I called. Maybe we should. And then Tom's torch went out, not gradually, not flickering. 1 second it was on, and the next second, the passage ahead of us was completely dark. We heard Tom say quietly, "Huh." And then, nothing. We called for him for 2 hours. I mean this literally. We searched the passage and the chambers for 2 hours. The passage was not long. It opened into 4 rooms and ended in a stone wall. There was nowhere to go. There was no other door, no gap in the stone, no opening we couldn't account for. We called his name until our voices broke, and then kept calling. Tom was gone. Chloe was on her phone. She got a partial signal near the gate. She called the emergency number she'd had written on her hand. The guest house had given it to her, which strikes me now as strange, though the guest house had seemed to know a few things that we didn't. I held the torch while she talked, and I kept it pointed into the passage, and I did not look away, and I did not hear anything, and that was, in a way, the worst part. Nothing moved. Nothing sounded. It was just the dark, and the smell, and the stone shelf in the room behind me, and Dan. Dan had not moved since Tom disappeared. He was standing in the first chamber. His hands were at his sides. His eyes were open. He was facing the stone shelf. I said his name several times. I touched his shoulder. I stood in front of him and put my hands on both sides of his face, which I have never done before in my life, and which felt both necessary and deeply wrong. He looked at me. He looked through me, more accurately. Whatever was operating behind his eyes at that point was something I didn't recognize as Dan. He sat down, slowly, carefully, with a deliberateness that I still see when I close my eyes. He lowered himself to the ground in the center of the room and crossed his legs and rested his hands on his knees and became still. I screamed at him. I grabbed his arm and pulled. He didn't resist, but he didn't come either. There was a weight to him that had nothing to do with his size, a settled quality that I cannot explain medically or physically. It felt, and I know how this sounds, like something that had decided. Chloe came back. She took one look at Dan and said we needed to get him out now, which we tried to do, and which we eventually managed. It took both of us, and it took a long time. And the whole time, he didn't fight us, and he didn't help us, and the expression on his face was the same one the monks wore in their cases. We got him to the gate. We got him down the mountain. The authorities arrived 90 minutes later. Tom was not found that night. He has not been found since. I've been asked, more times than I can count, what I think happened. The official account is reasonable. Tom became disoriented in the dark, found an exit we had missed, and either became lost on the mountain or suffered an accident on the path. Searches were conducted. They found nothing. The mountain is large. These things happen. Dan suffered a severe psychological episode triggered by the stress of Tom's disappearance and the intensity of the environment. He is receiving care. His prognosis is, officially, uncertain. I have sat across from that account and examined it from every angle, and I want to tell you honestly, I can't disprove it. There is nothing I experienced that night that constitutes evidence for anything beyond what can be explained. But I'll tell you what I know. I know that Dan stood in front of that monk's case for 20 minutes and came away changed in a way none of us registered at the time. I know that the old monk at the door told us not to go up at night because some of them were still listening. I know that the chambers in the sealed section had stone shelves positioned at exactly the right height for a person to sit, and that those chambers were sealed not from the outside but from the inside, which I only noticed when we were leaving and which I have thought about every day since. I know that when I got Dan to the gate of the sealed section and looked back down the passage, I saw, and I am aware that this was dark, that I was frightened, that human vision makes mistakes in low light. I saw that the room at the end was not empty. There was a shape in the chamber, seated, still, hands on knees. I told myself it was Dan, that somehow he had slipped back, that there was an explanation. I turned away. I kept moving. I have not gone back to check. I visit Dan every 2 weeks. He sits in the chair by the window. The nurses say he is calm. They say he doesn't appear to be in distress. His vitals are stable. He is being fed through a tube now because he stopped opening his mouth for food several months ago. When I sit with him, his eyes are always open, always pointed at the middle distance, always carrying the expression of a person who has understood something and is waiting patiently for it to complete. I don't know what he understood. I'm not sure I want to. What I'll tell you is this. If you go to Jiuhua Shan, and it is worth going, it is genuinely one of the most remarkable places I have ever been. Stay in the lower section. Walk the pilgrim paths. Light incense if the monks invite you. Look at the gold cases if you choose to, but don't stand in front of them for too long. And if you feel the urge to be still, to be quiet, to let the noise in your head settle into something slower, walk away. Those monks have been waiting for a very long time. Some of them, I think, are still looking for company.